Hey Merfolk fans, I'm Joe. Thanks very much for joining me today. If you'd like to support my channel, please check out the link above to my Patreon page. I'm here today with the second episode of the Flavor of the Week series. I've got my pal Kyle with me. Good morning, Kyle.
Morning.
Hey, so we actually tried to upload this last week. Some of you may have noticed that. Unfortunately, there were some technical errors with this video recording, so we're gonna give it another shot this week. Actually works out well because I think this deck is better positioned right now, given some shifts that are occurring in the metagame, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But essentially, we're here with a white-blue Merfolk build. White has definitely been tried in Merfolk to some success in the past. I think for a year or two, people were running these powerful white sideboard cards, things like Path to Exile in the main deck, to sort of supplement the blue side of the deck. We have a slightly different approach here. Kyle had the idea primarily of trying out Militia Bugler, and Kyle, if you want to talk about that.
Sure. I mean, basically, I just love value cards, and I looked at this card and said, "Wow, this would fit beautifully into Merfolk, and it's a value card, so I'm going to try it." And so yeah, I threw together a list. It looked a lot like this, but I was running Thalia instead of Sygg.
Right.
Right. And then Joe, you had the idea to try Sygg, and that's kind of when it all came together.
Yeah, because when you start to do unusual things with decks, you know, like splashing other colors, there can be options that you might not initially consider simply because you don't know about them. So I just wanted to revisit sort of which white Merfolk were actually available. So I just went to Gather and did just like an advanced search for white modern legal Merfolk. And a few things popped up, actually. You guys should look at that list because there's some really wacky Merfolk that have been printed. Very strange things. But Sygg actually is it's a pretty sweet card. So it's legendary, so it has that downside up front. Obviously, you can't have more than one of them on the board at any time. But it has native an island walk, sort of just on the card. So you don't need any lords. If the opponent has an island, you can just attack in for 2. So that's a nice upside off the bat. But really, the meat and potatoes of Sygg is his second ability, which is 1 white, one colorless, or I guess generic mana. Target Merfolk you control gains protection from the color of your choice until the end of turn. So in this sense, it's a bit like Mother of Runes, which anybody who plays Legacy knows is an extremely powerful card. The downside with Sygg is that it's a bit slower than Mother of Runes. It's a 2-drop, and its ability actually costs mana. You can't just tap him to activate it. Now the upside is that you can activate it multiple times if you've got multiple activations up with your mana. So basically, Sygg just protects your plan. You play out a Master of Waves. If you have a Sygg on board, it's going to be really, really hard for the opponent to remove him, and hopefully you'll have some insurance to help close out the game. So obviously, Sygg can be hit with Militia Bugler, but basically any of our Merfolk, since they're literally all 2 power in this list, can be hit by Militia Bugler. So it seemed like a pretty sweet idea because depending on where you are in any given game, if your opponent has a bunch of creatures that you need to deal with, you can dig with Militia Bugler and maybe draw into a Trickster, right? Or a Harbinger. If you have a nice board established, but all you need is an Island Walk Lord, you can dig into that. Oftentimes, I think the best thing to dig into is going to be a Master of Waves. So if you've got a couple of little 2-drops on board, draw into a Militia Bugler, vial this guy in, dig into a Master of Waves, cast that guy, and all of a sudden, you're pretty much in an unbeatable spot. There's a lot of decks that sort of just get stopped by Master of Waves, like really good against, I don't know, what are some decks like Hollow One? They have a really hard time dealing with him. I think Mardu doesn't like him too much either. They might have, these decks have like a singleton or maybe 2 of Collective Brutality in the main deck. So if they don't draw that, they're going to have a really hard time dealing with Master of Waves. So
yeah.
So pretty sweet card, Militia Bugler. Basically like 5 through 8 of Silvergill in this deck. A couple small differences that can be relevant is Silvergill can draw lands. whereas Militia Bugler is never going to get you a land. But that doesn't come up that often, really. So, as I was mentioning earlier, this deck, compared to all the other Merfolk variations, blue-green and mono-blue, basically, is the kind of the one that does the best in grindy situations. And Jund and black-green rock decks are seemingly on the rise with the printing of Assassin's Trophy. So having 8 creatures that can draw you into more creatures is kind of where you want to be if your metagame has a lot of grindy decks. Kyle, you agree on that, right?
Absolutely, yeah. My local shop actually has historically had a ton of combo decks, but pretty much, I think like over 75% of the usual combo players are currently building rock decks. So I'm planning on running this out at my local because it is going to be really good in those types of matchups.
Right. I mean, I totally understand why people are building Jund and rock right now. It's kind of an exciting time to be a Jund player because, I mean, Assassin's Trophy lets you blow up Tron lands. You can kill Karn. You can kill anything you need to. You can kill a Lord of Atlantis. You can blow up our Mutavault. You can do anything with that card. So it just seems like they're set to have a lot of fun in the coming weeks. So we should try to be prepared if possible. And in our experience, this deck does really well against those kinds of grindy decks. I know Kyle has had at least a couple 5-0s in leagues running this deck. Is that right?
I have, yeah. And, it was with the 4 Militia Bugler, 4 Sygg configuration that we are going to be showing to you all today.
Yeah. So right, there's obviously a lot of tuning that can be done. You can trim a card here, trim a card there, but we wanted to show you guys sort of the most what could be called stock build of this sort of brew. We kept all 4 Cs, despite the fact that Sygg provides some evasion. Spreading Seas is in the deck, not just for screwing up the opponent's mana plan, but also to give us access to evasion. With Island Walk, Sygg provides a bit of evasion by giving our creatures protection from certain colors so we can push through blockers. So if you wanted to, in a given metagame, add a certain card into the deck, for example, since this deck is best in grindy matchups and weakest against extremely fast aggro decks, you might be enticed to add things like Vapor Snags, for example. Vapor Snag can slow down a really explosive opening by the opponent while you're developing your board. And to make space for a card like that, you might trim a Seize or 2, since again, Sygg is providing some evasion. But this is a very stock build. There's just a bunch of 4-ofs. I want to talk about Sygg just for another second. Sygg is particularly good when you can use him in conjunction with AEther Vial, which is obviously another sort of central card to the Merfolk plan. We do best when we have a turn 1 AEther Vial. If you have an AEther Vial on 2 and Sygg in hand, it can be a pretty huge blowout if the opponent goes to cast a removal spell on one of your important creatures. In response, you can activate AEther Vial, bring in Sygg, give your creature protection from red, for example, if the opponent is trying to bolt a Lord and you're trying to push Island Walk damage. Vial and Sygg, pay 1 white, 1 generic mana, and suddenly your Lord has protection from red. Unless the opponent has another removal spell in hand to respond to that activation, it's basically going to counter that spell. So this might seem kind of pie in the sky, but it's what this card does, actually. And I've done it myself plenty of times, countering removal spells. And many times, opponents don't really know how to respond to the activation. They get now many times it is correct to respond immediately with another removal spell if they really need to get rid of that particular creature right then. But for example, if I give protection from red, the opponent might just rush and cast a Fatal Push right away, just to make sure the creature dies. It sort of short circuits them, and they're just like, okay, what am I going to do? I have to cast as much removal as possible right now. And I find it's great to be aware of those possible scenarios where you can get the opponent sort of on the wrong foot. You can do things like that with Regery, tapping their lands. I think I was playing against a blue-white opponent the other day, and I tried to tap one of their lands, just, I had nothing else to tap. Sometimes we're in a situation where we have no more value to get on our side. So he had like 3 lands up, and I targeted his land, and he ran out a Snapcaster targeting an Opt. since he had no white mana available on my turn. And there's a Path to Exile in the graveyard that if he had just waited until his turn, he could have snap pathed. But since I was threatening his mana, he felt it important to run out the Snapcaster right away. Now, I don't think that was a pro play by the opponent, but it's just to say that you can sort of push the opponent's button sometimes, and Sygg is definitely a button-pushing kind of card. So Kyle,
Sygg tilts people. Totally tilts people.
It tilts people, right? Because, yeah. I mean, you're tapped out, right? And who expects, their removal to get countered all of a sudden? Well, not tapped out, but to say you've got one white and a Mutavault up, right? And all of a sudden their crucial removal spell gets countered. Yes, it is definitely a tilting card, because who plays Sygg, first of all, right?
Yeah, well, and on top of that, you're not spending a card to counter their spell.
Right,
you're spending mana, and so it's virtual card advantage, and they can feel that, when it's happening.
Yeah.
None of your cards went to the graveyard, one of theirs did, and nothing happened.
Right, and you just have another creature on the board now.
Yeah.
In that sense, it's a little bit like Swift Warden, this like green, and then one generic mana card. I think it was from like Ixalan or whatever, where it had it flash. It's like a flash 3/3 Merfolk 3-drop, and seems like kind of an amazing card that a bunch of people wanted to work, but that just didn't really work. Why do you think Swift Warden didn't really fit?
Green.
Green, exactly. Yeah, that's a good call, because green is the splash, right? So we can't really go that deep on it. But we're set to get some Simic Merfolk in the next block of this Ravnica set, so or the next set of this Ravnica block. So who knows? Maybe we'll have a mono green Merfolk deck at some point in the near future.
or just like a base green, or a deck that takes out the Mutavaults and just goes really hard on being a blue-green deck, and then we can run cards like Jade Light Ranger and Swift Warden, other green.
Right. I think there's definitely going to be some exciting exploration and brewing to be done when these new Merfolk come out. Since they're going to be adding to the existing pool of solid green Merfolk that were released earlier this year. So yeah, I mean, the deck, I think we've pretty much given a good explanation of it. In essence, you've got these 12 cards here between Silvergill, Spreading Seas, and Militia Bugler that keep you drawing into gas. Harbinger and Trickster hopefully slow the opponent down. Even though we're running a little bit of white devotion, cutting things like Mirror Regeries to make room for a white card. Master of Waves, when he hits the board, there's almost always going to be a fair amount of blue devotion, so he's still kind of an incredible closer in this build. So the only thing that this deck doesn't really do very well is super fast explosive openings. I think in theory it can still get a turn 4 win, but it's really not aiming to do that. It's aiming to slow down decks that are trying to do that, and then win, turns 4 through 8, not turns 1 through 4. So
yeah, it's the kind of deck that wants to drag the opponent into the mid game, and late game, and just grind them into dust.
Yeah, and just get a lot more
card advantage.
Right, a lot more value out of each of our cards. So talking quickly about the mana base, we have, I believe, if I count again, 13 white sources, which is a good number if you want early access to white, which we do. Not so much for Sygg. Sygg is a little bit stronger in the late game when you have a lot of mana to activate him, but much more important, you want white mana for your powerful sideboard cards. If you're playing against an artifact deck or a graveyard deck, you want to be able to slam Rest in Peace or Stony Silence on turn 2. Often, if you can do that against those decks, you're going to be way ahead. So very important that you've got enough white sources. And again, we've got 6 fetches, so those count as white sources, since you can fetch Hallowed Fountain. So 6 plus the 2 Hallowed Fountain. Or Plains, exactly. We have the Singleton Plains, which can be very useful in a format full of Field of Ruin and Ghost Quarters, things that let you, or Path to Exile. You can go grab your basic Plains, and even if the opponent blows up your Hallowed Fountains with Field of Ruin, you can at least play Magic with a single Plains here. We've got the 6 fetches, 2 Hallowed Fountains, that's 8, and then 9, plus 4 is those 13 sources I was talking about. Wanderwine Hub, basically Tundra in Merfolk. It's a great card for us to be able to have access to. You can see we trimmed a couple Mutavaults, again, just because you really want to be able to consistently cast important cards on turn 2. We have intensive double blue spells, like our Lords, Harbinger, Trickster. You have Sygg, which is, double color. And then again, the important sideboard cards. So this is the mono base after we've tuned it a little bit. As I mentioned, Kyle has run a number of leagues with this deck. I did as well. And yeah, it's felt pretty good. We've done pretty well with it. It's a very viable alternative to mono blue and blue green. Again, it's sort of metagame dependent. If you're seeing a lot of grindy decks, this is probably the way to go. So let's go ahead and look at the sideboard a little bit. Kyle, you want to start off?
Sure. Yeah. So white has A+ sideboard cards. It's one of the big draws to the color for Merfolk. So we have 4 Rest in Peace because it just hoses a whole bunch of strategies that are really important, and strategies that it doesn't hose, it still really limits. Like Jund hates to see Rest in Peace.
Right, there's like a spectrum of decks that this card comes in against. It comes in against decks that just look to get value out of the graveyard. There's Jund type decks that have things like Tarmogoyf and Scavenging Ooze. Control decks that have Search for Azcanta that's trying to flip. You have
Snapcaster Mage,
obviously Snapcaster Mage, and let's see. So you've got those are the decks that just generate like extra value at the graveyard. But then you've got decks that are 100% built around the graveyard, like Bridgevine, Dredge, Living End, Grishelbrand. So and Rest in Peace is amazing against all of those decks. In the first case, it just chops off one of their legs. In the second case, it chops off both of their legs. So
that's gruesome.
Yeah, sorry, metaphorical legs. So rest in peace. One of the biggest pulls of playing white in any deck. It's just such a powerful card against such a large swath of the metagame. And then why did we choose to run 3 Stony Silences instead of 4?
I think we just wanted to be able to run 2 Settle.
Well, no, I think there was another. I think we decided that we have game against some of the artifact decks like KCI. We have things like Deprive and Rest in Peace also. Rest in Peace also hits KCI. Kruk Clan Ironworks combo, and against things like Affinity, we have extra stuff like Echoing Truth and Harbinger and Merfolk Trickster that help us out. So against some of the graveyard-centric decks, Rest in Peace is going to be extra important, so we felt the full 4 was necessary, whereas with Stony Silence, we felt that we could hedge a little bit in order to make some more space for, as Kyle was mentioning, Settle the Wreckage, which shores up, as I was mentioning, the weakness to aggro decks. If we can just get to turn 4, I resolved a Settle the Wreckage against Hollow on deck and got rid of like 6 or 7 creatures, and it immediately ended the game. So it's instant speed, hard for them to play around it. They don't expect it a lot of the time, just like they don't expect things like Sygg. So yeah, the white sideboard cards adding a lot to providing backup to the splash. We're not just go ahead. Sorry. Exactly. Another option for the sideboard. What were you saying?
So I didn't want to get away from Settle the Wreckage too far. So another option against aggressive decks is Blessed Alliance, which I've been testing recently.
Yeah, let me pull that card up. So, I mean, yes, this is an amazing card against aggressive decks, like creature aggro, like Settle the Wreckage, but it's also really good against things like Burn, where they're throwing lightning bolts at your face. You can just gain life and effectively negate one of their spells. So this is a little bit harder to pay for than like Collective Brutality, where you can just discard cards. You actually have to pay 2 for each extra mode. But it's still pretty flexible. I think the modes we're going to use the most with this card is the first and the last. We're going to gain life against Burn and aggro, and we're going to just make the opponent sack a creature.
Another deck this is really good against is Boggles.
Oh yeah, you're right. Edict effects are always great against them, right?
I mean, obviously, if they have a ley line out, then it doesn't work.
Yeah, right. If they have a Dryad Arbor, it's no good.
Well, they don't usually attack with their Dryad Arbors.
Oh, I guess that's true. Yeah. I guess they just.
You can.
That's a good call.
Yeah. So I blew out a Boggles player. They tapped out to put a Daybreak Coronet onto their boggle. It was the only creature they had, and they did not have a ley line out because they didn't expect to need it because it's Merfolk.
Right, we're not making them. We're not thought seizing them or whatever.
No, and then they attacked, and I had 2 mana up, and I just made them sacrifice.
Yeah, this was an interesting card when it was added to the modern sort of card pool, because suddenly there are situations where you should not attack, right? Like, for example, when we hit our 3rd land and slam Kira, for example, we're trying to set up our defense for the rest of the game. And if the opponent doesn't really seem to have any flyers, they can't interact with her, it's like, well, we're not going to block with her. Why don't we just poke in for 2 damage? Like, well, no, Blessed Alliance will get you,
I recall watching a video that you made probably a year ago. And where you attacked with Akira into a blue-white player, and they cast Blessed Alliance, and you were mad at yourself.
It's so bad. It's like it's one of the biggest possible blowouts, because first of all, your 3-drop is getting dealt with just a 2-drop spell, which is a tempo blowout, and we shouldn't be getting hit for tempo typically. So just on that foundational sort of basis, it's pretty terrible to lose Kira to this card. But then obviously Kira, they should have to spend 2 cards to get rid of her, or a Wrath, right? Not a freaking Blessed Alliance. So so you learn pretty quickly, like, when to not attack into white mana. But yeah, so this is a really strong card, a really good option. But for the league that we're going to show you guys, we were running Settle the Wreckage. As I mentioned, the videos that we did last week were unfortunately sort of corrupted for a pretty silly reason, I think. So we're going to show you guys a replay of the league that we ran last week. We just felt like it showed off a nice variety of angles that this deck can approach the format from. Rounding out the sideboard, we've got some old blue cards that do a really great job. Anybody who's been playing Merfolk for the last half year or year knows that Deprive is probably the most core sideboard card at this point. There was a ton of back and forth forever about what counterspells we should run. People were running any number of different counterspells, from
Dispel, Negate, Unified Will.
Yeah, Unified Will was a
Ceremonious Rejection.
A big point of contention between different camps of Merfolk players. People felt, well, we always have creatures. Why don't you play Unified Will? And the thing is, you don't always have creatures, and you don't always have more than the opponent. Like, if you have 2 creatures and the opponent has a Wormcoil Engine and they go to cast Karn, and you try to Unified Will it, you're like, oh yes, I've got the creature advantage. But they'll just, Spatial Contortion one of your creatures in response. Now all of a sudden you don't have more creatures, so they've killed your creature, they've countered your counterspell, and now they've got Ugin. So Unified Will is such a fragile card. If the opponent gets 2 Snapcasters out on the board and have managed to control you up to that point, Unified Will is literally just a dead card. Like, you can cast it, but it won't do anything. So anyhow, I maybe you can tell by my tone of voice, but I've played with Unified Will, and it was a big pain in my ass.
We know which camp Joe is in.
I hate Unified Will. I hate Unified Will. I mean, if your metagame is maybe only Titan Shift, then maybe you can run it. But then you're better off just running like a Flash Freeze, right?
Maybe. I mean, I was not hard. I wasn't in either camp, really strongly, but I ran Unified Will and enjoyed it. But yeah, so the thing is, since Deprive became, sort of known to the Merfolk community, I haven't needed to worry about this. None of us have.
Yeah, it's really right. Nice. The conversation is or the argument is behind us at this point, because so for those of you few who haven't really played Deprive, I know pretty much everybody's on it at this point, but just to explain to you guys who are not very familiar, it's 2 blue, so you really want to make sure that you're not running too many Cavern of Souls in your deck so that you can actually cast this spell. It has a downside of returning a land to your hand, but Merfolk is particularly well suited to run this card because often we don't care too much about our lands because we run AEther Vial. So this is it's sort of true for, some Vial decks in Legacy, if I'm correct, right? That run like Wasteland, right? I mean, you can you can use your land drop on things like Wasteland to destroy the opponent's land more efficiently because you're getting your creatures into play through Aether Vial, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when we
Death and Taxes in particular,
there you go,
does that a lot.
And you know, even Merfolk in Legacy, I don't know how many Wastelands we're on right now, but I know that historically we've been a deck that can comfortably run Wasteland, in part because we run Aether Vials.
Yes, very true.
So Deprive has the drawback, or apparent drawback, of having to return a land to your hand. However, there can be some upside, some fringe upside, and some, you know, very much sort of applicable, not too fringe upside. The fringe upside is, for example, if the opponent casts Ulamog and they target a Mutavault to blow up your Mutavault and blow up a creature, you can deprive the Ulamog and then bounce the Mutavault to your hand. So it won't even get destroyed by the Ulamog's cast trigger. So that's an example of a fringe benefit of Deprive, saving a Mutavault from an Ulamog cast trigger. Not so fringe at all. It comes up actually fairly often. Is if you don't have a land drop to make on your turn, and say you go straight to combat against control, and they try to cryptic your team, you can cast Deprive, pick up a land as the, you know, quote unquote drawback. And then in your second main phase, you can replay that land, and now you can use that mana again. So effectively, Deprive can often be cast for only 1 mana on your own turn. So the downside can actually be an upside. So you have, if we look at sort of the spectrum of possible situations, you have just a drawback where, you know, it sets you back a land drop that might have otherwise helped you, say, get your 4th land for Master of Waves. And that is... you know, to be fair, it is a real drawback. It slows your tempo down, but you're also countering an important spell that the opponent cast. And then beyond the drawback side of it, there's plenty of room for upside. So Deprive, since it can counter anything, has effectively, as Kyle mentioned, sort of replaced all of those other more niche counter spells. It can. The other day, I countered a Primeval Titan that would have won the game out of Amulet Titan. And I think a lot of times it really surprises them, because I don't think that they expect a hard counter for creatures out of us. But it's, you know, some of our weakest matchups are things like Titan Shift decks or Amulet Titan, where if they stick a big creature or an essential creature that we can just lose on the spot, Deprive gives us outs to that kind of thing. And Echoing Truth, whenever you take Echoing Truth out of the deck, you realize why we had it to begin with, right? It's one of those cards that you're like, oh, you know, I've got Harbinger, I've got Trickster, why am I running these Echoing Truths? And then the very next game, your opponent will play an Ensnaring Bridge. And then the game after that, they're going to play a Worship, you know? And so
after that, they're going to make 30 Goblin tokens.
Right, so we need ways, first and foremost, we need ways to be able to deal with Ensnaring Bridge and Worship. And then there's obviously the extra benefit with Echoing Truth of being able to bounce tokens. Mardu, Pyromancer is not going anywhere. It's a very popular deck. And then there's a bunch of other strategies that run Lingering Souls. You've got old school Abzan decks. You've got... Lingering Souls is a good card. It's in a lot of decks. And being able to bounce 4 spirit tokens can be really important if you don't have access to Island Walk. So... Echoing Truth, very, very good card. Can also save your own creatures in response to a board wipe. It's actually really important to know your matchup as far as whether you should be playing out multiples onto the board. If you're playing against blue-white control and you have a choice with one of these guys on the board of running out another one of them or running out a Lord of Atlantis, against blue-white control, you should pretty much, well, depending on, I guess, where you are in the game, it can matter which one you run out. If you're afraid of a board wipe, you might want to run out the second Master of the Pearl Trident, so that in the event that the opponent does have like a Supreme Verdict, you can bounce both of them back to your hand. You know, if they've already played a Detention Sphere, they're not likely to have another one. But if they haven't played a Detention Sphere, you want to be aware of that, because you don't want them to get like insane value detaining 2 of your Master of the Pearl Trident. So when to play multiples and when not to play multiples. If you have an Echoing Truth in hand, that's an excellent time to play multiples out. Even against something like Jund, if you have an Echoing Truth for whatever reason, it's not really a card we want against them. But just as an example, if they go to Maelstrom Pulse, a Silvergill Adept, you know, you have Echoing Truth ready and you can get a ton of value just by bouncing those 2 guys back to your hand. So super versatile card, one of the most versatile spells that we have access to. So that's why we have 2 of them in the board. And I think that just about has touched on every point that we have to make here. So
I think so.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and jump into the replay. Thanks for joining me, guys, and I'll see you in the next video.